The first few minutes of the very first episode of Invincible contain a high-security prison break, two old superheroes joking about getting older, a teenager flipping a garbage truck end over end because he finally has powers, and a father quietly watching his son fail at being a hero, and the show asks you to accept all of that as a normal Tuesday in this world. The strange trick of it is that almost every single person who walks through those first few minutes is somewhere on the ladder we are about to climb tonight, from people who can do nothing extraordinary at all, to the ones who can crack continents in half. Tonight on Rock, we are going through every Invincible character we can verify, ranked from the bottom of the power chart all the way up to the beings the show treats as gods, and we are going to be honest the whole way about what is actually proven on screen, what comes from the comics, and what fans have only theorized. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, settle into the pillow. This is going to be a long, slow walk, and if you have not subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these. We start at the bottom of the ladder, which on a show like this does not mean weak or unimportant. It just means unpowered, mortal, ordinary, in the way the rest of us are ordinary, surviving in a world where the sky can open and rain down something that breaks the rules. The very first person who belongs there is Art Rosenbaum. Art is the Grayson family tailor, a small man with steady hands who runs a small shop, who works thread by thread, who has known the family for years, and who carries the kind of patience that only comes from spending a lifetime crouched over fabric. In the animated series, he is written and performed as a soft, dependable, almost grandfatherly presence, the family friend who finds out about the double life early and simply absorbs it, who keeps the secret, who keeps stitching. He has no enhanced strength, no speed, no exotic biology, no training that would let him survive a single second on the receiving end of any other entry on this list. And yet he is here, at the Foundation, because the show keeps quietly reminding you that beneath the bright costumes and the orbital mech suits and the alien invasions, there is still this small human work being done. A man holding a torn cape under a desk lamp, repairing a sleeve that has been ripped open by a punch that could have flattened a city block. There is something tender in that. There is also something the show needs you to feel, which is that Art's ordinary life is what the heroes are nominally protecting, and that the gap between his world and theirs is enormous, but it is not contemptuous. He stands at the bottom of this ranking, but he is not the joke at the bottom, he is the floor. A half step up from Art, but still firmly in the world of the Unpowered, sits Olga, who in the show appears as the widow of one of the Global Defense Agency's most striking heroes. Olga has no abilities of her own, no enhanced biology, no equipment, no training. What she has in her brief appearances is one of the most devastatingly human stories the first season puts on screen, because she is a woman whose entire life was built around a man who could no longer slow down to live it, and then around the aftermath of losing him in a way the public will never properly understand. She belongs on this list at all, because the show treats her grief as a kind of pressure inside the larger story, the human weight that gives the destruction its meaning. She cannot fight back against anything that happens to her. She cannot avenge anything. The show implies that the people who do have powers in this world are, by their existence, constantly draining people like her, and her placement at the bottom of the ranking is, in a sense, the entire moral argument of the series in miniature. Just above her, in the same human, unpowered bracket, sits Donald Ferguson in his original incarnation. When we first meet Donald in the show, he is Cecil Stedman's right hand at the Global Defense Agency, a serious, controlled, deeply competent operations man who carries a sidearm, who manages teleporter coordinates, who walks into burning rooms with the calm of a man who already knows the building's structural plans. He has no powers. He has tactical training, intelligence access, and the trust of arguably the most powerful unpowered man in the country. But in the very early episodes he is, for the ranking we are building, a human being, full stop. Where he sits is complicated by what is going to happen to him later, but at his starting point on this list, he is just a sharp, brave, mortal man working in an inhuman job. The show takes a long time before it lets you understand quite how exposed he was to risk, and quite how much of him is, by the time we are deeper into the series, no longer entirely human. We will come back to that version of Donald much higher up the list, and the gap between the two will tell you something about how the show treats sacrifice. William Clockwell is the next rung up, Mark Grayson's college friend and roommate, a young man with no abilities and no ambitions in the superhero direction, whose function in the show is to be the one person Mark can be honest with about his life on a peer level. William is sharp, kind, observant, and unpowered, And what makes his ranking interesting is that the show keeps quietly underlining how dangerous his proximity to Mark actually is. He stands next to a person whose enemies regularly punch through buildings, and he stays. He learns the secret, he keeps it, he picks Mark up after the worst nights of his life, and the show treats that loyalty as a kind of strength that the power ranking will never quite be able to measure. By the standards of who can hit hardest, William is near the bottom. By the standards of what he means in the structure of Mark's life, he is closer to the top than the ranking can show. We are going to keep noticing that tension all the way through the list tonight, because it is, in a sense, the show's whole thesis on power. Amber Bennett, Mark's girlfriend for much of the first stretch of the series, lives in roughly the same bracket. She has no powers. She is a college student with a strong sense of justice, an activist streak, a willingness to be sharply critical of people she cares about, and a temper that the show treats with real respect rather than as a joke. What makes Amber land on this list at all, beyond being a major character, is the same thing that makes William land, which is that she chooses to remain close to Mark even after she understands what his life actually is. The show is careful to frame her anger at him, not as her being unreasonable, but as the entirely fair response of a person who keeps getting stood up, lied to, and left behind because the world keeps ending. The argument the show is making here, read this way, is that being unpowered in a world full of gods is itself a kind of constant, low-grade ordeal, and that it deserves to be ranked, even if the ranking by raw force puts Amber far below the people she is dating. By raw power, she sits in the human bracket. By the cost of being in this story at all, she carries more than the ranking can show. Debbie Grayson is the matriarch of this whole story, Nolan's wife, Mark's mother, and on a pure power scale she is an ordinary woman who works in real estate. She has no enhanced strength, no biology that gives her any edge, no training to fight any of the things that walk through her front door. What makes her one of the most important figures on this entire list, and what makes her placement complicated, is that the show consistently treats her psychological strength as the spine of the whole family. Across the run of the series, she has to absorb the discovery of what her husband actually is, the loss of any version of the marriage she thought she had, the slow understanding that her son is becoming something she cannot follow, and the constant, grinding fear that any phone call could be the last one. She drinks, she breaks, she rebuilds. She is among the most psychologically resilient figures in the show, and the only reason she ranks where she does on a power chart is that the chart is measuring the wrong thing for her. By any strict reading of who could survive a fight with whom, Debbie is at the bottom. By the standards of who has to endure the most without ever once being able to throw a punch back at the thing that is hurting her, she is at the top of her own private ranking that the show seems to acknowledge in almost every quiet scene she gets. Andressa belongs in this same bracket, the Thraxan woman Nolan partners with after he leaves Earth. She is a member of an alien species whose biology is short-lived and fragile by Viltrumite standards, and although she is not powerless within her own world, on the universal ranking we are building she sits very much in the lower bracket. What makes her significant to the larger story is that she becomes a second mother to a child who is going to end up much higher on this list, and that her existence sets up the question of what Nolan was actually looking for when he left Earth, whether it was redemption, escape, or something stranger. Exactly where the show goes with her is something to verify as more episodes air, and the comic version of her arc is not something to spoil here as if it is confirmed on screen, but at the time we are speaking of, Andressa sits in the human tier of the ranking, valuable to the story for what she carries emotionally, rather than for any force she can produce. Cecil Stedman is where the unpowered tier gets interesting, because Cecil is a perfectly ordinary man by biology, and yet he is arguably one of the 5 or 6 most powerful figures on the entire chart by virtue of what he commands. Cecil is the director of the Global Defense Agency, the man with the teleporter pin, the man who has files on every superhuman, the man who can call in the Guardians of the Globe, or strike teams or experimental weapons at a moment's notice. He has no enhanced strength. He has no speed. The show is careful to remind you, in a quiet scene now and then, that he is just a man in a suit, and yet the suit hides a mind that has been running this country's superhuman policy for a very long time. The argument the show makes about Cecil, read this way, is that human politics in a world with gods is not powerless, it is just morally exhausting, because every decision he makes involves trading one tier of lives for another. He can pull anyone on this list out of a fight by teleporting them away. He can scramble anyone on this list with a sound frequency, if he has prepared for them. The placement of Cecil in any honest ranking is genuinely contested, because if you are ranking by what someone can do to your face in a fight, he is a low entry, but if you are ranking by what someone can do to your life from a desk, he might be in the top 10. We will keep him here in the lower bracket for the sake of the ranking by biological power, with the strong note that the show repeatedly proves that this placement underestimates him. Donald Ferguson, as he comes to be by the middle of the series, is a different entry from the Donald we placed earlier. Without spoiling specifics that have aired versus those that have not, the show takes Donald through an arc in which his body is no longer entirely the body he started with, and his relationship with the agency and with Cecil becomes something far more complicated than employer and aide. By the time the show reaches the back half of its current run, the Donald you see has had a great deal done to him, and what he can endure, and possibly what he can deliver, is higher than the strict human baseline. He still does not approach the power tiers of the people we will reach soon, but he is no longer a man with a sidearm. He is a man who has been rebuilt, who carries the institutional weight of the agency in his actions, and whose continued service in a job that has nearly killed him many times is one of the show's quiet tragedies. He sits, on this ranking, a notch above the strictly human characters, in a small bracket of his own. Damien Darkblood enters our power chart here, an outlier in almost every direction. Damien is a detective from what the show describes as a hellish origin, who arrives on Earth in pursuit of the truth behind the murder of the original Guardians of the Globe. He is not human, not in the way the previous entries are, but in terms of the raw force he can apply to a fight, he is not in the upper tier either. What he carries is a presence, a relentlessness, a refusal to drop a case that the show treats with real menace, because he keeps appearing in places he should not be able to enter, and he keeps knowing things he should not be able to know. The point the show makes about him is that some forms of power are about access rather than damage, and that a detective who cannot be killed in any ordinary way, who cannot be threatened with anything he has not already endured, is genuinely dangerous to the people whose secret he is circling. The show implies, without spelling it out in the kind of monologue another series might give him, that Damien is bound by rules from his own world that limit how he can act, and that those rules are the only reason the people he is investigating have any breathing room at all. By raw output, he sits in the lower middle of this ranking. By psychological pressure on the higher entries, he is one of the most effective figures the show has. Dr. Sinclair, who goes by D.A. Sinclair in most of his appearances, comes next, a graduate student at Mark and Williams College, whose research project becomes one of the show's earliest and most quietly horrifying threats. Sinclair builds what he calls reanimen, which are exactly what the name suggests: human bodies that have been gutted and rebuilt into compliant, weaponized drones. He himself is a thin, bespectacled, completely unimposing man with no physical training, no strength, no speed, no exotic biology, and on the strict measure of what he can do in a one-on-one confrontation, he sits very low on this list. But, like Cecil at a much smaller scale, his power lives in what he can deploy, and a reaniman is genuinely capable of harming or killing a person who would otherwise have a long life ahead of them. The show implies, without ever quite making it a speech, that Sinclair represents something the series is going to keep coming back to, which is what happens when a brilliant mind without empathy is given access to bodies the world has stopped paying attention to. He himself does not rank high in raw force. What he produces, what he is allowed to keep producing, eventually does. We are placing him here in the lower bracket on his own physical capability, with a note that any ranking that ignores his outputs is missing something important about him. The biplane, or to use the show's slightly silly nod to old comics, the figure who flies an actual antique aircraft in modern superhero brawls, sits in roughly the same bracket as Sinclair, although for very different reasons. He has no enhanced biology, no special training beyond his piloting, and his power on this list comes from a small, antique, weaponized vehicle that has no business being competitive in a world full of beings who can fly without a craft. The biplane is one of those entries the show uses to make a small point about how this universe has decades of leftover hero and villain history behind it. Characters who built a brand around a gimmick in an earlier age, and who have never quite stopped trying to make it work in the modern one. He is, by raw output, near the bottom of the powered tier. By thematic value, by what he tells you about the genre the show is gently parodying even as it takes itself seriously, he is more interesting than the ranking can show. The Mahler twins arrive next on the chart, and they are an unusual case for a ranking like this one, because their physical specs by themselves are not extraordinary. They are large, strong men, smarter than almost anyone else on this list except for the elite of the elite, and they are scientists of a caliber that the show treats as one of the rarest resources in the world. What pushes them up the chart, just a little, is that they keep producing technology, cloning processes, and weapons that have shaped events much higher on this list than they themselves can reach in a fistfight. The argument the show makes about them, read this way, is the same one it keeps making about Sinclair and about Cecil, that the line between a man and the systems he can build is the line a power ranking always blurs. The Maulers can hold their own in a brawl, with low-tier opposition. They can build mid-tier weapons in a basement, and they are functionally unkillable in the way that matters in serial fiction, which is that one of them is always able to clone the other back. On raw output, in a vacuum, they are an upper-lower entry. With the wider definition of power that the show seems to invite, they belong a notch higher. Dr. Seismic, who goes by Doc Seismic in the show, comes next, an enhanced human with the ability to manipulate seismic energy and trigger geological events. The show introduces him as a vain, broadcast-hungry villain with a clear sense of theater, but it is careful to demonstrate that the power he carries is genuinely dangerous. He can crack streets, he can shake structures, he can produce localized events that the show treats as a real city-scale threat for the heroes who confront him. He is not strong enough to threaten anyone in the upper third of this list, but he is the first entry on our climb where the show really makes the point that a power scale is not linear, that a man with the right ability can do an enormous amount of damage without ever being able to throw a punch hard enough to bruise a Viltrumite. He sits in the lower middle of the chart, dangerous to civilians, dangerous to lightly powered heroes, ultimately outmatched by the upper tiers. Titan slots in around the same area, with a different argument. Titan is a strong, rock-skinned figure with a body that the show treats as durable enough to take hits and to throw heavy ones back, and the early arcs of the series use him as a mid-tier antagonist who exists in a complicated relationship with Cecil's department. He is not a top-of-the-chart fighter. He is genuinely dangerous to anyone in the bottom half. His placement on this list is partly about raw output and partly about the way the show uses him to argue that not every villain in a power-tier story is a monster, that some of the people swinging fists at the heroes are doing it for reasons the show treats as real, even if those reasons do not excuse the harm they cause. He is in the lower middle of the chart by force. He stays in the audience's memory longer than that placement suggests. Multi-Paul belongs in this bracket as well, a villain whose ability is self-duplication and who, as far as the show has so far developed him, appears as part of the wider villain ecology around the Order and its assassins. The duplication power, read for what it actually does on screen, gives him crowd control value, the ability to swarm a single hero and split their attention, the ability to absorb a few losses and keep coming, and the show is careful to suggest that there is a real limit on how many he can make and how quickly he can recover. He is, in raw individual force, a relatively low entry. As a tactical complication for the heroes who have to fight him, he is one of the genuinely useful villains the show keeps in rotation. Mr. Liquid sits in a similar bracket, an enhanced human whose body can shift into a liquid form. The argument the show makes with him is that body transformation powers, even at a relatively modest level, are surprisingly hard for ordinary fighters to handle, because the standard punches and grabs are simply not productive against a person who can become water. He is not strong enough to threaten the upper tiers, who can either freeze him, vaporize him, or simply ignore him long enough to find an answer, but he is genuinely difficult for the mid-tier opposition. The show uses him as part of the wider ecology of mid-tier villainy that the Guardians and Teen Team have to manage week to week, and his placement here on the chart reflects that he is a real problem for the bracket below him without ever quite breaking into the bracket above. Kill Cannon arrives in the same area, a tech-enhanced villain whose entire identity is built around a single heavy arm cannon. He has no enhanced biology, no super speed, no exotic abilities, and his power on this list is the gun he is bolted to. The show treats him as a serious threat to civilian areas and to lightly powered heroes, and as a relatively short stop for anyone in the upper half of the chart. Like the biplane, like Sinclair, he is the show's way of letting you feel that this world has a long tail of mid-powered, weapons-based villainy that the heroes deal with constantly and that the audience rarely sees in the main story. He is a low to middle entry by force. He is part of the texture of this world more than he is a turning point in it. King Lizard, and the wider Lizard League he leads in some appearances, belongs here as well. An enhanced human or hybrid figure with reptilian features, whose abilities center on physical strength, claws, and animalistic intimidation. The show frames him as one of those antagonists who occupies a permanent place on the second or third tier of villainy, formidable for the heroes who do not specialize against him, manageable for the ones who do. He is a fixture of this universe's villain ecosystem, rather than a singular threat, and his placement here reflects that. On the strict ranking, he is low to middle. In the wider sense of who pops up over and over again to remind you that the world keeps producing this kind of person, he is a useful recurring presence. Komodo Dragon, who shares this animal-coded bracket, fits the same description with slightly different parameters. He is enhanced, dangerous to civilians, fast and aggressive, and ranked at a level the show treats as a mid-tier threat. The series does not always distinguish carefully between the various reptile-coded villains in its early roster, which is a small comic book joke in itself, that the world has produced more than one of these characters, and that they have a kind of overlapping presence. He sits in the lower middle bracket by force. The Tether Tyrant is one of the show's more visually distinct early threats, a figure whose extending, prehensile limbs let him control a battlefield by spatial reach, more than by raw strength. The show uses him to demonstrate that, again, raw power on a chart like this one is not the only metric, that an opponent who can grab and immobilize heroes from a distance is dangerous in ways a stronger, but less mobile opponent might not be. He is in the lower middle of the chart by force, and his real value to the show is in giving the audience the sense that this universe has a full bestiary of villainy, that the threats are not all variations on the same theme. Octobos belongs in a similar bracket, the leader of a small criminal crew whose look and whose modus operandi nod, in the cheerfully exaggerated way the show sometimes does, to an older era of comics villainy. He is not a top-tier threat. He is the kind of recurring antagonist who turns up in skies or in waterfront raids, who keeps the heroes' lives full of mid-tier problems, and who the show uses as part of the same texture argument that puts the biplane and kill cannon and King Lizard on the chart at all. By raw force, he is in the lower middle of the ranking. By the role he plays in establishing what this world's villain economy actually looks like, he is part of the Foundation. Embrace fits in this same area, a metahuman whose ability is a kind of physical attachment, the power to latch onto a target and become extremely difficult to remove. The show treats Embrace as one of those mid-tier irritants, a villain who has clearly been around the block, who has tactics, and who the heroes know how to handle once they have seen the trick. She is not a major upper-tier threat. She is a useful component in the show's argument that even relatively unglamorous powers can produce a real career in this world. Magnetak rounds out this bracket of mid-tier powered villains with the ability to manipulate magnetism, which the show treats as genuinely dangerous in the right circumstances. Magnetism powers in this universe, as in most superhero fiction, are limited mostly by writer intent and by the metal content of the environment, and Magnetak is consistently placed as a competent but not headline-level threat. He is in the lower middle of the chart by raw output. He is another reminder that the show has built out a full mid-card of villainy beneath the headline stories that drive each season. Furnace, an enhanced figure whose powers are fire-based, sits in the same area, and the show uses him in some of the larger group fights as part of the wider ensemble of supervillains. He is not the most powerful pyrokinetic the show implies exists, and he is comfortably below the headline level of villainy in his own appearances. His placement here reflects that, although the show is careful to remind you, with him as with several others in this bracket, that even mid-tier fire powers can do a great deal of damage to ordinary civilians, and to mid-tier heroes who do not have an answer for them. Magmanite belongs in the same ecological niche, an enhanced figure whose abilities involve heat and possibly molten material, slotted into the same general tier of mid-power villainy as Furnace and adjacent characters. The series does not give characters in this bracket the deep individual focus it reserves for the upper tier, and the practical effect is that we know roughly what they can do, we know roughly where they sit, and we know that the heroes treat them as serious but ultimately handleable. He is in the lower middle of the ranking by force. He is part of the texture more than a chapter of his own. Universa is the first figure on this list, whose comic incarnation is so much grander than what the show has so far put on screen that we have to be careful about how we describe her. In the source material, she is a cosmically powerful being, capable of feats far above the bracket we are placing her in for the purposes of the show. By the screen evidence we have actually been given, or that the show has so far implied, the version of Universa we have is closer to a serious mid-power threat than a top-tier one. The honest move for this ranking is to place her here on the screen, evidence we can verify, with a note that the comic version of her is meaningfully higher up the chart, and that the show may yet move her up as more episodes air. She is, by what we have actually seen, in the lower middle. By what the comic argues she could become, she is much higher. We will respect what the show has actually shown. Machine Head is a more substantial entry, an enhanced human whose head has been replaced by a heavy mechanical apparatus and whose mind is consistently shown to be one of the most calculating in the criminal half of this universe. The argument the show makes about Machine Head is that he is not the strongest villain on the chart. He is one of the most organized, the kind of figure who runs a criminal empire that touches almost every story the heroes get pulled into. He has tactical power, network power, leverage power. He has, in his actual physical form, no superhuman force to speak of, although he is capable of withstanding more than a normal man could. His placement here, in the upper edge of the lower bracket, reflects the same kind of argument we made about Cecil and the Maulers, that this world's most dangerous figures are not always the ones who can throw the hardest punch. He is a mid-tier entry on the raw force ranking. He is a top-tier entry on the kind of ranking the show seems to argue actually matters. Powerplex is one of the show's more emotionally complicated middle-tier figures, a man with the ability to absorb and redirect energy, who, when the show finally gives him his proper arc, turns out to have a personal grievance against Mark that has been building for far longer than the audience initially understands. His powers, on paper, are mid to upper mid-tier, capable of generating real damage against a Viltrumite if he can get the timing right, and the show handles his arc as a careful argument about collateral consequences, about who pays the price when the heroes throw each other through buildings. He sits, on this ranking, in the middle of the chart by force, although the show is careful to make the case that his rage is more dangerous than his raw output, because he is willing to do things a stronger figure might shrink from. Angstrom Levy is the next major entry, and his placement on a power chart is one of the most interesting puzzles the show offers, because he is, on the surface, an unpowered man, a scientist with a moral position, who acquires through an accident the ability to access alternate versions of himself across a wider multiverse. The show treats Angstrom's arc as one of its quiet but central tragedies, a man who started from a place of good intentions, and who ends up, through a series of choices and losses, in a position of intense personal hatred toward Mark Grayson. The question of how powerful Angstrom actually is on a chart like this one is answered very differently depending on which incarnation you are looking at. As a man, he is in the lower bracket. As a being who has accessed many different versions of himself, he is much higher, with knowledge and intent that put him in genuine top-half territory. The show implies, read this way, that he is one of the most dangerous antagonists in the entire run, not because he can outpunch a Viltrumite, but because he can plan around them, can find them when they think they are safe, and can carry grudges from one reality into another. He sits, in the most honest reading of the screen evidence so far, in the middle of the chart, with a note that his trajectory points up. Shapesmith is the first member of the Guardians of the Globe in their reformed era to enter our list, an alien with a Martian heritage who can reshape his body and pass for human in conditions where that matters. The argument the show makes with Shapesmith is that even within the Guardians, the team that nominally represents Earth's first line of defense, there is a wide range of raw power, and that not every member is a top-tier brawler. Shapesmith's abilities are useful in infiltration, in survivability, in adaptability, and he is shown to have real personal courage. He is not a top-of-the-chart fighter. He is a member of a top-tier team. His placement here, in the upper middle of the lower bracket, reflects that the show treats him as competent, brave, and meaningfully outclassed by anyone in the upper half of the ranking. Black Samson takes the next slot, a former Guardian of the Globe whose career has been complicated by the changing nature of his abilities. The show is careful with Black Samson because his arc involves losing and regaining and rethinking his relationship with the strength he was once known for. In the periods where his powers are at full force, he is a real upper-middle-tier strongman, capable of holding his own against most of the villains we have already listed, and a number of the ones we have not yet reached. In the periods where his powers are diminished or absent, he relies on an exoskeletal suit that puts him back into the fight with a different kind of force. The show treats him with real respect, both for his physical capability and for the way he carries the institutional memory of the original Guardians. He sits, on this ranking, comfortably in the middle, with a note that his peak is higher than his average, and that his courage to stay in the field at all is itself a kind of power the chart does not measure. Bulletproof, whose civilian name fans have pieced together as Zandale Randolph, is one of the show's late introduction members of the next generation of heroes, a young man with skin that resists almost all forms of conventional damage and with enhanced strength and resilience besides. He is treated by the show as a clear upper-middle tier figure, capable of standing in line with the heavier Guardians, capable of taking hits that would kill a normal hero, and capable of inflicting damage that puts him several brackets above the mid-tier villains we listed earlier. The argument the show makes with Bulletproof is, in part, a generational one, that the era of the founding heroes is closing, and that the new figures are going to have to carry the weight. He sits, on this chart, in the middle, on the cusp of the upper bracket, depending on the day and the matchup. By the standards of the team he joins, he is genuinely strong. By the standards of the very top of the chart, he is still in the supporting cast. Shrinking Ray comes next, a member of the teen team, and later the Guardians, whose ability is precisely what the name says, the power to reduce her size dramatically. Size manipulation powers in this universe, as in most superhero fiction, can be used in much more interesting ways than a casual reading suggests, and the show is careful, in Ray's appearances, to show that she is far more than a punchline about being small. She can fly into spaces no other hero can reach, she can deliver attacks at angles no one can defend against, and she can survive encounters that would kill a normal-sized hero through sheer evasion. She is not, by raw force, a top-tier figure. She is, by tactical value, much higher than her placement on a strict power chart would suggest. She sits, on this ranking, in the middle, with a note that her usefulness in a specific fight may put her well above her formal slot. Duplicate, one of the founding members of the teen team and later a member of the Guardians' wider rotation, sits in a similar bracket with a different argument. Her ability is duplication, the power to produce multiple bodies of herself, and the show treats her abilities with real care, demonstrating both the practical value of being able to swarm an opponent and the personal cost of the various limits and risks her power involves. She is, like Ray, a tactical force multiplier, more than a raw upper-tier brawler. The show is also careful to show that her arc, especially as it interacts with Rexplode and with the broader teen team's evolution, carries some of the series' more emotionally complicated storytelling about young people in a profession that keeps killing or wounding the people they love. She is in the middle of this chart by force, with a long arc the show keeps developing. Monster Girl is the next entry, a teen team member whose ability is to transform from a young girl into a hulking, monstrous brawler with very real upper-middle tier strength, but at a horrific cost the show takes seriously. Each transformation, in the show's logic, ages her in reverse, so the more she uses her powers, the younger her actual body becomes, even as her mind, in some versions of the arc, races ahead. The argument the show is making with Monster Girl, read this way, is one of the heaviest in its whole catalog, that the power of being able to win a fight you would otherwise lose is paid for in a currency none of the other power tiers on this list have to spend. She is, in raw output during her transformation, an upper-middle tier figure, easily capable of beating most of the villains we have already named, and capable of standing alongside the Guardians in a serious battle. Outside of the transformation she is, by the chart's measurement, a child. She sits, on this list, in the middle, with a deep note that her placement here does not begin to capture the cost of every fight she shows up in. Rexplode, whose civilian name is Rex Sloan, sits in much the same bracket as the other teen team members, with his own particular twist. His ability is to induce explosive charges in objects he touches, which the show uses in a number of clever ways, and his arc takes him from a swaggering teenager into one of the show's most quietly moving figures by the end of his on-screen story. By raw output, he is comfortably in the middle of this chart, capable of doing real damage with a fingertip, capable of inflicting injuries on figures who would otherwise outclass him by sheer biology. By emotional weight, particularly in the way the show handles the late stages of his arc, he is one of the most resonant entries on this entire ranking. He sits in the middle of the chart by force. He sits much higher on the chart of who the show actually treats as a hero, in the full sense of the word. Robot, whose civilian name is Rudolph Connors, often shortened to Rudy, is one of the show's most morally complex entries, and his placement on a power chart depends heavily on how you read his arc. As Robot, he commands one of the most sophisticated remote-operated body designs the show is willing to imagine, with strength, durability, and weapon systems that put him into the upper-middle bracket on raw output. As Rudy, in the body the show eventually gives him through a series of moral compromises we will not spoil here as if it is fully resolved on screen, he becomes a meaningfully different kind of figure. The argument the show is making with Robot, read this way, is the question that quietly threads the whole series. What would you do to be able to live in the world the way other people live in it? He sits, on this chart, in the upper middle by what he can deploy. He sits, on the moral chart the show implicitly maintains, in a place the audience is encouraged to spend a long time thinking about. Darkwing is the next entry, a guardian of the globe whose abilities mark him as the show's deliberate, slightly knowing analog to a certain kind of darkness-coded hero from another publisher's roster. The argument the show keeps making with Darkwing, in his various incarnations, is that being smart, well-trained, well-funded, and willing to operate in the shadows can put a non-superpowered or lightly powered figure into a higher bracket than a strict measurement of his strength would suggest. He is not, in raw output, a top-tier figure. He is, in tactical and survival capability, a more dangerous opponent than several entries with louder powers. He sits in the upper middle of this ranking, with a note that his actual position can shift depending on which incarnation of Darkwing the show is currently using, and that the lineage matters. Aquarius, the Underwater King and a member of the Guardians of the Globe in their earlier incarnations, takes the next slot. He is a serious upper-middle tier figure, with the kind of raw strength and durability the show consistently associates with characters from his civilization, and with the political weight of representing a major undersea power. The show treats Aquarius with a degree of respect that pushes his ranking up, even though his on-screen feats place him below the very top of the chart. He sits, on this list, in the upper middle, with a note that his political role makes him in some respects more important than his raw force. Warwoman is here as well, an original member of the Guardians of the Globe whose abilities place her firmly in the upper middle tier, with raw strength and combat skill that the show treats as part of the founding generation of heroes. She is not the top of the chart, but she is a strong, formidable frontline figure, and the show's careful treatment of her early in the series is part of how it makes you understand the stakes of what happens to the original Guardians. She sits in the upper middle of this ranking, with a note that the show treats the loss of her and the others of her tier in the original team as a genuine reduction in the world's capacity to handle threats. The Green Ghost is in the same bracket, an original guardian of the globe whose abilities lean toward intangibility and the more spectral side of the power chart. She is a real upper-middle tier figure, capable of contributions to the team that the strict ranking does not always capture, because intangibility powers are useful in ways raw strength is not. The show treats her with real respect and uses the original Guardians tier, collectively, as the baseline for what a serious upper-middle team looks like. She sits in the upper middle of this list. Red Rush, the speedster of the original Guardians of the Globe, is the next entry, and his placement is one of the most interesting on the entire chart. Speed in this universe is treated as genuinely top tier in its own way, because Red Rush can move so quickly that for him, time effectively dilates around the people he is engaging. The show is careful to give him a brief but very memorable demonstration of how a being who moves at that speed actually thinks. The slow narration of seconds inside the blink of an eye, the calm recognition of what is happening just before it happens. He is, by that measurement, far higher on the chart than his raw striking power would suggest, because a being who can think and move in time the rest of the world experiences as paused is, in a sense, untouchable to most of the villain bracket we have already named. He sits, on this list, in the upper bracket, comfortably above the mid-tier, with a note that the show implies his upper limit is constrained by the wider rules of the Guardian's setting and by who happens to be punching at him at any given moment. He is one of the figures the show treats with a particular kind of tenderness in how it depicts the cost of his ranking. The Martian Man, who appears in the show in a form complicated by some of the early plot turns the audience has to absorb, sits in the upper middle of this ranking. The Martians as a species in the show are treated as a real interstellar power, with shape-shifting abilities and biological capabilities that put their average members well above the average Earthling. The show's specific Martian figures take a number of arcs we will be careful not to spoil here as if they are fully on screen, and we are going to leave the ranking at upper middle by what we have actually been shown, with a note that the species' place in the wider galactic politics implied by the series is greater than any individual figure suggests. Adam Eve is the next figure we have to spend real time on, because her placement is one of the genuinely contested questions on this list. Eve is, in the show's actual canon, a being whose ability is the manipulation of matter at a subatomic level, and the show is careful to demonstrate, in scenes spread across its run, that this is not the cute construct power early appearances might suggest, but a fundamental ability to rearrange the physical world. The argument the show keeps making about Eve, in nearly every season it has so far given her, is that her power has been mentally limited by an early intervention in her training, and that when she lets go of that limitation, she belongs much higher on this chart than her routine appearances suggest. She has been shown to reshape biological matter, to heal injuries that the show otherwise treats as permanent, to create and unmake huge constructs at a scale that, taken seriously, makes her arguably the most versatile being on Earth in this universe. Her placement on this list is therefore the moment we cross from the upper middle of the chart into the top bracket. She sits above the original Guardians, above all of the standard rogues we have already met, and depending on which version of her power the show is currently emphasizing, she may belong somewhere even higher than this placement. The honest middle ground for the ranking, given what has actually aired, is to place her at the bottom of the top tier, with a note that the show keeps quietly arguing she could be much higher if her own self-imposed limits ever fully fell away. There is an argument, which the show implies and many fans have made, that Adam Eve is the single most potentially powerful character on Earth in this universe, that her ability to reshape matter is, taken to its logical conclusion, the kind of power that makes the planetary tier of villainy irrelevant. We are going to be careful here. The show has not yet, in what has aired, given her the full, unrestrained demonstration of that ceiling. We will place her, in good faith, near the top of the upper bracket, with a note that her placement could move further up if the show continues the arc it is implying. The Immortal is the next figure on the climb, and his placement is one of those entries that depends on which axis of power you weight most heavily. As his name suggests, he cannot easily die, returning from injuries that would permanently end any of the figures we have already discussed. He is an extremely durable, very strong, very experienced upper bracket figure who, in the show's history, has been a member of multiple incarnations of the Guardians of the Globe, and has lived through enough of human history that he carries a kind of memory none of the other heroes can match. By raw striking power, he is in the upper bracket but not at the very top, capable of fighting Viltrumites but not of beating them on equal terms. By sheer endurance, by the way the show frames him as a figure who can absorb damage that would simply end another hero, he belongs in the top bracket. He sits, on this ranking, in the upper bracket, comfortably above the Guardian's baseline, beneath the very top of the chart. His emotional arc on the show, particularly in the way the series handles the question of what living forever actually does to a person, is one of its more careful pieces of writing, and although the chart cannot rank a man's grief, the show keeps making the case that grief is the actual price of his entry on this list. Battle Beast is the next major entry, and on a power chart he is one of the most unambiguous figures in the entire series, because everything about how the show introduces him is designed to communicate that he occupies a tier of his own. Battle Beast is a tiger-like alien warrior whose entire reason for being is combat, and the show treats him as a figure who can stand on his own ground against Viltrumites, which by the chart standards puts him at the very top of the upper bracket and on the cusp of the top tier. His first major appearance in the show, in a scene that pits him against several of the Guardians and against Mark Grayson himself, is one of the moments the audience first really understands that the upper tier of this universe contains beings who can shrug off damage that would kill almost anyone else on this list, and who can in turn deliver damage that the chart's middle bracket cannot meaningfully resist. He sits, on this ranking, comfortably in the top bracket, and his exact placement against the Viltrumite tier is one of the small, fun arguments the show invites the audience to keep having. He is, on a strict raw power reading, just beneath the strongest Viltrumites we will meet. He is, on the question of who would choose to die in a fight rather than walk away, in a tier none of the Viltrumites occupy. Lucan is the first of the Viltrumites we are going to discuss on this list, and his appearance in the show is one of those moments that confirms what the audience has come to suspect about Nolan's people, that they are a species whose average warrior is at a tier the rest of the universe cannot easily match. Lucan is one of the small team Nolan's people send to recover him at a key moment in the show's run, and his on-screen demonstration of force, his durability, his willingness to inflict damage casually, puts him in the top bracket of this ranking immediately. He is not the strongest Viltrumite the show has implied exists, but he is a member of an elite species that the chart treats as fundamentally above the standard upper tier. The argument the show makes with Lucan, read this way, is that the Viltrumite Empire is built on a baseline of fighters who would be top-tier figures in any other species, and that even the names you barely remember by the end of an episode would be terrifying threats in any other context. He sits, on this ranking, in the top bracket, near the bottom of the Viltrumite tier. Vidor is in essentially the same bracket, another Viltrumite from the same general grouping, a fighter who is, by the chart's measurement, in the top bracket on his species alone. The show does not give every named Viltrumite its own deep individual arc, in part because the politics of the Empire involves a great many warriors who pass through the story without individual focus. Vidor's role in the chart is to confirm, again, that the species baseline is in the top tier, and that even the figures the show treats as mid-level Viltrumites are still well above any of the Earth heroes we have already discussed in the upper bracket, with the possible exception of Adam Eve at the height of her abilities. He sits, on this list, in the top bracket, near Lucan, comfortably above all but the most cosmic of the entries we will meet next. Craig, or General Craig as he is sometimes addressed, is the next Viltrumite the show develops in real depth, a hardened warrior whose role in the Empire's larger plans gives him a more sustained presence on screen than Lucan or Vidor. Craig is a figure the show treats as one of the more capable individual Viltrumites you will see, with a temperament that adds an edge to the species' baseline, a willingness to escalate, a confidence in his own capability. By the chart's raw measurement, he is firmly in the top bracket, with combat ability and durability that put him alongside the very best Viltrumite line fighters. He sits, on this ranking, in the top bracket, with a small upward note that his role in the Empire's wider operations and his individual screen time give him a slightly higher profile than the standard line warriors. The show has used him to make several of its quieter, more troubling points about how the Viltrumite Empire actually thinks about war, about who they consider real opponents, and who they consider obstacles to be cleared. Anissa is one of the most morally complicated figures on this entire ranking, a Viltrumite warrior whose role in the Empire and whose direct confrontations with Mark Grayson the show has used to make some of its most difficult points. By raw combat ability, she is firmly in the top bracket, an elite of her species, capable of inflicting damage at a level the chart's upper middle cannot meaningfully resist. By the arguments the show implies and the comic spells out, her presence in the story raises questions about what the Empire's mission actually involves and what the cost of survival under that mission is. We are going to be careful here about not stating comic-specific events as if they have aired in the show. What we can say, on what has been shown, is that Anissa is a Viltrumite of meaningful elite standing, whose confrontations with Mark Grayson the show treats as some of the heaviest beats in its whole run. She sits, on this ranking, in the top bracket, near the upper bound of the Viltrumite line tier. Oliver, Mark's half-brother in the show, is the next figure, and his placement is one of those entries that the chart will need to revisit as the show continues. Oliver is the child of Nolan and Andressa, born in the parallel arc Nolan pursues after his departure from Earth, and his hybrid biology gives him an accelerated growth and abilities that, by the standards of any other entry on this list, are already extraordinary. In the show's middle stretch, Oliver is a child by appearance and a real upper bracket figure by capability, with a flight, durability, and strength profile that the show treats as comparable to that of a young Viltrumite. The argument the show keeps making with Oliver is that he is a particular kind of inheritance, a child of two species whose adult capacity is open and whose moral position the audience is going to have to keep watching to understand. He sits, at the time of speaking, in the top bracket by capacity, with a small note that his arc has a great deal of room to grow, and that the chart could move him up considerably as later episodes air. We are going to respect what has been shown, and not project comic events onto him as if they are confirmed for the series. Conquest is one of the show's most decisive entries in the top bracket. He is one of the Viltrumite Empire's most accomplished warriors, a figure who is sent specifically to handle resistant targets, who has lived long enough in service of the Empire to have developed a personal taste for the work. The show, in his on-screen appearances, is careful to make the point that he is materially above the standard Viltrumite line tier, that he can inflict damage at a level even other Viltrumites would respect. His confrontation with Mark Grayson is one of the most heavily weighted single fights in the entire run of the series, and the show treats the outcome as a generational shift in the story's larger arc. He sits, on this ranking, in the top bracket, near the very top of the Viltrumite line tier, beneath only the most exceptional individuals in the species, and beneath the cosmic entries we will reach soon. Mark Grayson, who is Invincible, sits at the next slot on this chart, which is to say in the very top bracket and on a trajectory the show keeps explicitly framing as upward. Mark is a half Viltrumite, born on Earth, whose flight, strength, durability, and combat ability place him in the top bracket of this universe at the time of his middle arcs. The show is careful to demonstrate that, even when he is outclassed by particular individual opponents, he is genuinely in their tier, that he can survive damage they intend to be fatal, and that he can deliver damage they have to take seriously. The argument the show keeps making with Mark, more than with any other figure on this list, is that the chart's raw measurement of his power is, in a deep sense, beside the point, because the question the series is built around is not how strong he is becoming, but what he is becoming as he gets that strong. He sits, on this list, near the top, with a clear note that his ceiling is implied to be much higher than what we have so far seen. The chart cannot measure the moral question the show wraps around him. The chart can only confirm that he belongs in the top bracket, and that the run is implying he belongs at or near the very top by the time it ends. Nolan Grayson, who is Omni-Man, is one of the most decisive entries on this entire ranking. Nolan is a Viltrumite warrior of significant rank, one of the most accomplished members of his species' military traditions, and the show uses him from its very first episode to set the audience's understanding of what the top of this chart actually looks like. The first season finale, in particular, is one of the most extended demonstrations the show ever gives of what a Viltrumite at the top of his ability is willing to do, and the carnage on display is the moment most viewers understand that this is not a series that uses its top tier as set dressing. Nolan sits, on this ranking, in the top bracket, near the very top of the chart, comfortably above his son's middle arcs, and comfortably above the line tier of Viltrumites. His placement against the very top of the chart depends on a small number of comparisons we will get to shortly. What is unambiguous is that the show treats him as one of the most powerful figures it has ever directly put on screen, and that his trajectory in the wider story has him in close conversation with the entries above him on this list. Theoridus is the next entry, an old Viltrumite of legendary standing whose place in the wider galactic story the show develops as it expands into space. By most accounts in the implied background of this universe, Theoridus is an extraordinarily capable figure, one of the rare members of the Viltrumite species who has stood as a meaningful counterweight to the Empire's leadership, and his ability profile is at the very top of his species. By raw striking power, he is in the very top bracket, comparable to the strongest Viltrumites the show has implied exist. By political and tactical capability, he is, in the wider story the series is gradually telling, one of the most important figures the universe contains. The exact details of how the show develops his arc are something we should leave to confirmed episodes. What we can say is that he sits, on this ranking, in the very top bracket, near the top of the chart. Thragg is the next major entry, and although his on-screen presence in the show is something we should not overstate, as if all of his comic story has aired, the implied position the series gives him, and the position the source material assigns to him, makes him one of the most decisive figures on the chart. In the comics, Thragg is the supreme commander of the Viltrumite Empire, and the implication is consistent with where the show is heading. He is, by the source's measurements, at or near the absolute peak of Viltrumite capability, in a bracket of his own at the top of the chart. We are going to be careful here. The show may or may not have given us all of his deepest demonstrations of force. The honest position for the ranking is to place him, by what the show has confirmed and what the comic supports as a general reading, at the very top of the chart, with a note that his exact placement against the most cosmic of the entries we will reach next is one of the genuinely contested questions the audience and the show keep relitigating. He sits at the top of the Viltrumite tier of this list. Alan the Alien is the last major entry we are going to dwell on at length, and his placement is one of the most interesting on the entire ranking. Alan begins, in the show's earliest appearances, as a comic relief figure of sorts, a friendly alien whose role in the larger galactic politics is gradually revealed as far more important than his early appearances suggest. By the middle of the show's run, the Alan we have seen has gone through changes that move his ability profile dramatically upward, into the bracket where he can meaningfully engage with Viltrumites and survive. The argument the show keeps making with Alan, read this way, is that he is one of the very small number of figures in the universe whose growth curve has put him at the top of the chart, and that his role in the wider story is as a counterweight to the Empire and to its specific elite. He sits, on this ranking, in the very top bracket, near the highest point on the chart, with the exact comparison to Thragg and Theodos, and the most exceptional Viltrumites left, as one of the open arguments the show keeps offering. He is, by everything the series has shown so far, in the top bracket of this entire list. Having walked the spine of the chart, from the most ordinary human in the show, all the way up to the figures who can stand against the Viltrumite Empire on its own ground, we are going to slow down now and revisit some of the entries that the strict ranking did not quite give enough room. A power chart on a show like Invincible is, in the end, only a frame, and the show keeps insisting in nearly every episode it has so far given that the interesting questions live in the corners of the frame rather than at the top of it. Some characters we have already named carry placements that deserve a deeper look. Other characters we have not yet named have either been implied or already confirmed, and they add to the texture of this ranking. And there are questions about what the upper bracket of this universe actually looks like that the show keeps asking, and that the audience keeps trying to answer. We begin that second pass with the Reanimen, which we mentioned briefly when we placed D.A. Sinclair. The Reanimen, as the show develops them across the early seasons, are not a single static threat, but an evolving line of work, a project that goes through generations of design as Sinclair learns from each failure. The early Reanimen are clumsy, ungainly, easily defeated by the teen team in their first major engagement. The later Reanimen, in the project's more refined phase, are tougher, faster, and more dangerous, and there are moments in the show where the audience can feel the cold, incremental progress of the work that Sinclair is doing, the way each generation of his prisoners has been gutted to make the next batch a little more efficient. On the chart, the average Reanimen sits in the lower middle bracket by raw output, comfortably above an ordinary human, comfortably below any of the upper-tier figures we have named. As a class, however, they belong on this list, because the show keeps quietly making the case that the Reanimen are an early demonstration of a particular kind of evil this universe is going to keep producing, the evil of treating human bodies as resources for a project that is more important to the person designing it than the lives he is consuming. We will leave them in the lower middle bracket with that note. Donald, as he stands by the middle of the show's run, deserves a return visit on this chart, because his arc is one of the most quietly devastating arguments the series has so far made about the cost of working for Cecil. Across the seasons, the audience comes to understand that Donald has been put back together more than once after injuries that would have killed an ordinary man, and that his current body is a composite of the man he was, and the systems Cecil's agency has been willing to install in him in order to keep him useful. The chart cannot easily place him in this state, because his physical capability is now meaningfully above the strict human baseline, and his durability is, in some respects, beyond the bracket the show has established for figures of his original tier. We are going to revise his placement upward, just a little, into the lower middle of the chart, with a note that what makes this revision possible is not a power that he chose, but a series of harms that he survived. The show is careful to frame Donald's continued service as a kind of muted grief, the steady persistence of a man who is not entirely sure what he is anymore, and the chart, in its small mechanical way, will reflect that. Adam Eve, whom we place near the top of the upper bracket on the chart's first pass, deserves the deepest second look of any figure on this list, because her ceiling is, by most honest readings of what the show keeps implying, possibly the highest of any of the heroes in this universe. The early seasons keep returning to the idea that her father, in some form, mentally constrained the scope of her abilities when she was a child, that the version of Adam Eve we have been watching is a constrained version, and that the unconstrained version would be a different kind of figure entirely. The show has, in moments scattered across its run, offered the audience glimpses of what the unconstrained Eve might look like, and those glimpses lean into the kind of matter manipulation that, if extended fully, would put her at or near the very top of the chart, in a bracket where the question is not whether she could beat a particular opponent, but whether the opponent even has a body she would choose to leave intact. We are going to keep her placement on the formal chart where we put it, at the top of the upper bracket on the cusp of the very top, with a clear note that the show keeps implying her ceiling is higher, and that future seasons, if they continue the arc, may justify moving her up further. There is a reading of Adam Eve, supported by passages in the source material and by the show's own narration, in which she is the single most consequential individual character in the entire run, and the chart should at least acknowledge that reading, even if we do not commit to it on what has aired. The Immortal also deserves a second look, because his placement on this chart is partly about the question of what immortality actually means in a serial story. He has been a hero since well before the founding of the modern Guardians of the Globe, and the show, in flashbacks and in the way the older characters refer to him, treats his presence as a kind of living museum of this universe's history. A power chart cannot measure a man's grief, but it can note that the immortal's experience and his persistence give him a tactical edge that figures of comparable raw power do not have. He has fought versions of the threats the heroes face now in earlier configurations. He knows the rhythms of how each villain class tends to operate, and he has the patience of a being who has watched the same kinds of crises arrive again and again across many lifetimes. We are going to keep him in the upper bracket, beneath the Viltrumite line, with a note that on the chart of who is most likely to still be alive at the end of a given season, he is at the very top. Battle Beast deserves a deeper second look, because the show keeps using him to make a particular kind of point about what a life lived entirely for combat actually looks like. He is, in his on-screen appearances, a figure who is more alive in a fight than at any other moment, who treats the meeting of opponents as a kind of sacrament. The audience meets him in a brawl that the show treats as one of the most decisive demonstrations of the upper tier in its whole run, and the way he carries himself in that fight, the calm of a being who has been waiting for opponents like this for longer than the audience can guess, is what places him so high on this chart. The show implies, without making it a speech, that Battle Beast is one of the very small number of figures in this universe whose raw striking power is genuinely comparable to the Viltrumite Elite, and that his only real ceiling is whatever pride or honor code prevents him from doing certain things in a fight. He sits, on this ranking, in the top bracket. He is, in the smaller chart of who would terrify the upper Viltrumites if they had to face him on equal ground, in a tier of his own. The Viltrumite line tier, taken collectively, deserves a deeper second look, because the show keeps making the case that what makes the Empire genuinely dangerous is not the existence of any single elite warrior, but the depth and consistency of the species baseline. Every Viltrumite, in the way the show frames them, is in the upper bracket of this universe. Every Viltrumite, by their species biology, by their training, by their cultural commitment to combat, is a top-tier figure on the chart we are building. The argument the show keeps making about the Empire, read this way, is that you do not survive an invasion by their species by being a strong individual hero. You survive it, if you survive it at all, by figuring out how to convince enough of their warriors that the cost of the work is higher than they want to pay, or by finding allies whose own species can stand against the Empire's baseline. The chart cannot fully express that argument, but it should at least note that the Viltrumite presence in the upper bracket is not a coincidence and is not a list of exceptions. It is a feature of the species that the chart's structure is reflecting. Conquest deserves a return visit, because his confrontation with Mark Grayson is one of the moments the show uses to put a particular question to the audience, the question of what it would actually take for a being like Conquest to lose. He is sent specifically because the Empire considers him capable of handling Mark, and the show is careful to demonstrate the asymmetry of the meeting, the difference in experience, the difference in casual capability, the difference in the way each of them thinks about the act of fighting. Conquest, read this way, becomes the show's argument that the upper tier of this universe contains figures whose ability to inflict damage is not really limited by their own bodies, but by the cultural codes they have chosen to operate within. He sits on this chart at the top of the Viltrumite line tier, near the very top of the chart, with the note that his confrontation with Mark is one of the moments the audience first really understands what the Viltrumite Empire is capable of when it intends a meeting to be terminal. Anissa deserves a return visit as well, because the show has chosen, in her appearances so far, to use her presence to ask some of its most difficult questions about the Empire's mission and about what is being asked of its warriors. The chart cannot fully rank what the show is doing with her arc, but it can note that she is one of the elite of her species, that her on-screen demonstrations of force put her in the very top bracket, and that her role in the larger story has been deliberately heavy. We are going to be careful here about not stating comic-specific events as if they have aired in the show. What we can say is that Anissa is, by the chart's measurement, near the top of the Viltrumite line tier, and that the show keeps quietly arguing that the implications of her presence are larger than her immediate placement suggests. Nolan deserves a return visit at significant length, because his placement on this chart is, in the show's careful framing, one of the central questions of the entire series. He is, in the first season finale, used to deliver the audience's first proper understanding of what a top-tier Viltrumite is willing to do, and the show's later seasons keep returning to the question of what kind of figure he is becoming as his arc progresses. By raw striking power, he is one of the strongest individual figures in the show's confirmed continuity. By tactical and combat experience, he is one of the most accomplished members of his species. By emotional weight, by the show's treatment of his arc as one of its central spines, he is in a category of his own that the chart's mechanical measurements cannot fully capture. He sits, on this ranking, in the very top bracket, near the highest point on the chart, with the small note that his placement against Thragg and against the very top of the cosmic tier depends on details the show has not yet fully delivered. He is, on what has been shown, in the top bracket. He is, in the smaller chart of who the show keeps treating as the most morally weighted figure in the entire series, in a tier none of the others occupy. Mark Grayson deserves the deepest return visit of any figure on this list, because the show is, fundamentally, about him, and the chart's placement of him is in some respects beside the point of what the series is doing. The early seasons place Mark at the bottom of the upper bracket, a Viltrumite hybrid whose abilities are still developing, and whose ceiling is implied to be very high. The middle seasons demonstrate, in carefully staged confrontations, that Mark is rising on the chart, that he can survive damage from figures who would casually end most of the heroes we have already named, and that his raw striking power is genuinely closing the gap on the elite of his father's species. The implied trajectory, in what the show has so far given us, is that by the end of his arc, Mark will be one of the most powerful individual figures in this universe, comparable to the top of the Viltrumite tier and possibly meaningfully above it. The chart cannot quite predict where that placement will land, because the series is still telling the story, but it can note that Mark's trajectory points up, that the show has been remarkably consistent in framing his arc as one of accumulating capability, and that the question of where he will end up on this chart is one of the genuine narrative questions of the series. He sits, at the time of speaking, in the very top bracket. He is, by the show's implied trajectory, on the path to the very top of the chart. Alan the Alien deserves a return visit at significant length, because his placement on the chart is, in the show's careful framing, one of the most genuinely contested questions in the upper bracket. Alan begins, in the early seasons, as what looks like a comic relief figure, a friendly alien whose role in the story is to give Mark a friend at his power tier and to provide some lighter beats. The middle seasons reveal that Alan's role in the wider galactic politics is far more important than his early appearances suggest, that he is, by the time the show's deeper arcs are underway, one of the most consequential figures in the universe's resistance to the Viltrumite Empire. By raw striking power he has, by the middle of the show's run, demonstrated that he can engage Viltrumites on something close to equal terms, which by the chart's standards puts him in the very top bracket. By his role in the wider story, by the gravity the show gives his appearances, by the way the other top-tier figures treat him as a peer, he is in a category that the chart can only sketch in outline. He sits, on this ranking, in the very top bracket, near the highest point on the chart, with the note that his placement against Thragg and against the very strongest Viltrumites is one of the open arguments the show keeps offering. He is, by any honest reading, one of the most consequential individual figures the universe contains. Thragg deserves a return visit at length, because his placement on this chart is, in the wider story the show is gradually telling, one of the central questions of the entire series. As the comics depict him, he is the supreme commander of the Viltrumite Empire, the figure whose decisions shape the Empire's wider strategy, and the source material treats him as the most powerful individual Viltrumite who has ever lived. The show has, at the time of speaking, given the audience a sense of his presence, rather than the full demonstration of his power, and we should be careful not to project comic-specific feats onto him as if they have aired. What we can say, on what has been confirmed, is that the show treats him as the figure at the top of the chart, the being whose ability is implied to be greater than any individual hero the universe has so far produced. He sits, on this ranking, at the very top, with a small note that his exact placement against Alan and against the very strongest of the wider cosmic figures depends on details we will leave to confirmed episodes. He is, by every reading the show invites, and that the source material supports, in the highest bracket of this entire list. Cecil Stedman deserves a return visit at significant length, because his placement on the chart in the strict measurement of his raw power obscures what the show keeps making the case is his real role in this universe. Cecil is, in the show's careful framing, the man who decides which of the figures on this chart get to operate and how, the man who chooses which villains are imprisoned and which are deployed for the agency's own purposes, the man whose moral compromises are, in a sense, what allow the rest of the chart to function. The argument the show keeps making about Cecil is that the existence of a chart like this one is itself a problem, that a world where some beings can do what the upper bracket of this list can do is a world that requires a man like Cecil to keep the system running, and that the cost of his work is something the audience is supposed to feel and to weigh. He sits, by raw power in the lower bracket of the chart, an unpowered man with a teleporter pin and a desk. He sits, by the chart of who actually decides what happens to the figures on this list, in the top bracket of his own private ranking. The show has, across its run, given Cecil some of its most morally weighted scenes, and his presence on this chart is a reminder that the chart cannot quite measure what the show is doing. Debbie Grayson deserves a return visit at length, because her presence on the chart at the bottom of the unpowered tier obscures what the show keeps making the case is her real role in the series. Debbie is, in the careful framing of the show, the figure whose endurance, whose capacity to absorb the implications of what her family is one of the central emotional spines of the whole run. The chart cannot rank what she does. It cannot measure the cost of being the mother of a being whose ceiling is implied to be the top of this entire list, of being the wife of a being whose actions in the first season are among the most destructive the show has ever staged. It can only note that Debbie is, by the show's careful treatment, one of the most important figures in the series, and that her placement at the bottom of the chart on raw power is the opposite of a judgment on what she is contributing. She is in the lower bracket by force. She is in the highest bracket on the chart of who the show treats as the figure who has paid the most to make the rest of the story possible. We are going to add now a small number of figures the show has either confirmed or implied that the first pass of the chart did not fully address. There are characters in this universe whose appearances are brief, but whose placements deserve at least a note, and there are figures from the wider galactic story whose presence in the show's implied background pushes the chart's upper bracket in directions worth noting. Space Racer is the next entry, a figure from the wider galactic background of this universe, whose appearances in the show have been measured, but whose role in the implied story is significant. Space Racer is, by the source material's measurements, and by the show's framing of his appearances, a top-tier cosmic figure with a particular weapon, a long career of resistance against the Viltrumite Empire, and a tactical capability that places him in the upper bracket of this entire list. He is not, on what has aired, demonstrated to be at the very top of the chart, but he is comfortably in the top bracket, in a tier where his presence in a fight is genuinely consequential for the figures we have already named. He sits, on this ranking, in the upper bracket, on the line between the top tier and the cosmic tier, with a note that his role in the wider story is implied to be larger than his individual appearances suggest. The Coalition of Planets, as a wider organization, deserves a note here as well. The show has, in its development of the galactic background, sketched a wider resistance to the Viltrumite Empire that includes a number of species and a number of individual figures whose specific names and capabilities are not always fully fleshed out on screen. The chart cannot rank a coalition as a single entry, but it can note that the existence of the coalition implies a number of figures in the upper bracket whose individual placements we have not yet specifically addressed, and that the wider story the show is telling involves a number of beings whose entries on this list will only become possible to make as more episodes air. Kursk and the Lizard League, taken collectively, deserve a note here, because the show has used them in a number of group fights to establish what a mid-power villain team looks like in this universe. The individual members of the League are in the lower middle of the chart, comparable to the other mid-tier villains we have already named, and their main contribution to the chart is to remind us that this universe has a constant background of mid-tier criminal activity that the Guardians and the Teen Team are dealing with, even when the major arcs are not in focus. The Flaxen Invaders, a recurring antagonist species whose appearances the show uses to make a particular point about time dilation, deserve a note as well. The Flaxens, in the show's careful framing, are a species whose home dimension experiences time at a different rate from Earth, so that the time the heroes spend defeating an invasion corresponds to centuries of Flaxen history. The argument the show keeps making with them, read this way, is that the upper bracket of this universe is not just a matter of raw striking power, but of the strange physics of how time and space interact with the various species the heroes have to face. The individual Flaxen warriors are in the middle of the chart by force, but as a wave, their tactical placement is harder to pin down, and the show keeps using them to make a point about how the chart's structure cannot fully account for what is going on. The Mahler twins, on a second look, deserve a small upward note, because their continued role in the show's larger story keeps demonstrating that their value to the chart's wider ecosystem is larger than their individual physical capability. They keep producing the technology, the cloning processes, and the experimental work that other figures on this chart end up needing. They are, in a sense, the figures whose work makes some of the upper bracket entries possible, and the chart's structure should at least acknowledge that. We are going to keep their placement in the upper-lower bracket, with the note that their tactical influence on the chart is meaningfully larger than their individual entries suggest. Powerplex deserves a small return visit, because his arc on the show is one of the more careful demonstrations of how the chart's middle bracket can contain figures whose emotional weight on the audience is larger than their raw output. He is, in the show's careful framing, a man whose grievance against Mark is rooted in collateral consequences from an earlier event, and his appearances are some of the moments the show uses to make the argument that the chart's higher tiers are paid for in costs that the chart itself cannot measure. He sits in the middle bracket by raw output, with the note that his arc is one of the heavier emotional weights the show has produced. Angstrom Levy deserves a return visit at length, because his placement on this chart is one of the most contested questions in the audience's reading of the series. He is, by raw striking power, a relatively low entry, but by his ability to access many versions of himself across a wider multiverse, his tactical capability is in the upper bracket of the chart's wider definition. The show has, in his on-screen appearances, made the case that Angstrom is one of the most dangerous antagonists in the entire series, and that the chart cannot fully measure the threat that a being like him represents. He sits, on this ranking, in the middle of the chart by force, with a clear upward note that the show keeps quietly arguing his actual placement is higher than the strict measurement of his raw output suggests. A brief note here on the wider Viltrumite background, because the show has implied the existence of a number of figures whose individual placements we have not specifically addressed. The Empire has, in the show's careful framing, a population of warriors at a meaningful upper bracket baseline, and the chart's structure could comfortably accommodate dozens of individual entries from that population if the show eventually delivers them. We are going to leave that note here, with the understanding that the chart we are building is for the figures the show has actually confirmed, and that its upper bracket is implied to be substantially deeper than the individual entries we have named. We turn now to a stretch of the chart we have so far only mentioned in passing, the figures who exist at the edges of the show's main story, but whose placements are part of why this universe feels as large as it does. The Invincible series, even with the focus it keeps on Mark, is a story about a planet whose superhuman population is unusually deep, and any honest ranking has to spend time with the figures who fill that depth. The Sequids are the first of those figures, although it is a stretch to call them a single character, rather than a class of being. The Sequids are a species of small, parasitic life forms, whose individual members are relatively low on the chart, but whose group behavior produces a tactical threat that the show treats with real menace. Each individual Sequid can attach to a host body, and, in their hive form, they share information across the swarm, which means that the chart cannot really rank them as individuals at all. A single Sequid is in the lower bracket of this list. A swarm of Sequids attached to an appropriate host species is in the upper middle bracket of this list, and the show, in their on-screen appearances, treats them as a genuine wide-scale threat, with implications for the entire upper tier. The argument the show keeps making with the Sequids, read this way, is that the chart's structure is built around individual figures, and that some of the universe's most dangerous threats come from beings whose chart entry has to be made as a collective. We will leave them in the lower bracket as individuals, with the note that their group placement is several brackets higher. Hosts of the Sequids, in particular the upper tier figures who have been compromised by their attachment, deserve a small note here as well. The show has, in its galactic story, demonstrated that figures of significant individual capability can have their behavior reshaped by a Sequid host, and that the resulting being is something the chart cannot fully measure. The implication of those moments, read carefully, is that the Sequids are one of the small number of threats in this universe whose tactical danger is greater than the raw striking power of any individual member, and that the chart's upper bracket is, in a sense, vulnerable to them in ways the individual entries do not suggest. The reanimated and reconstructed figures Cecil's agency keeps producing are the next item that deserves more attention than we have so far given. The show has, in moments scattered across its run, demonstrated that the agency is willing to revive or repurpose dead or defeated heroes and villains in ways that the audience is meant to feel uneasy about. The reanimated figures, whatever their original chart placement, are typically in a tier below their living self, because the show is careful to make the case that the rebuilt versions are not the same beings, that something has been lost in the process, and that what the agency has produced is a tool rather than a person. The chart cannot rank these figures with the same scale we have been using, because their placement depends on which original figure they have been built from, but it can note that the existence of the reanimated tier is one of the show's more sustained moral arguments about what the agency is willing to do. The original Guardians of the Globe, taken as a collective, deserve a return visit here, because their placements on the chart have been individually addressed, but the collective implication of who they were and what their loss meant for the upper bracket of this universe has not been fully explored. The original Guardians, as the show frames them, were the team that Earth assumed was sufficient to handle any threat that might arrive, and the first season's pivotal event makes the case that this assumption was always wrong, that the upper bracket of this universe is deeper than the team's collective capability would have allowed it to address. The chart's upper middle bracket is, in part, made up of the figures who were the founding heroes of this world, and their loss is one of the moments the show uses to argue that the chart's structure is more fragile than the audience initially assumes. We are going to keep their individual placements where we put them, with the collective note that the loss of their tier is one of the events that drives much of the wider story. The reformed Guardians of the Globe, the team that takes over the Guardians' role in the show's middle seasons, deserve a return visit as well. The new team is, by the chart's measurements, in a comparable bracket to the original team, with individual members in the upper middle and the cusp of the upper bracket. The argument the show keeps making with the reformed Guardians is that the role of being Earth's premier defense team is a heavy one, and that filling the chairs of the original Guardians is a kind of work that requires a great deal of personal cost from the people who agree to do it. The chart's upper middle bracket is, in a sense, the place where the show keeps locating the team that has to be Earth's first line of response, and the individual placements of the reformed Guardians reflect that the show treats them as serious, capable figures who are, nonetheless, not the top of the universe. A brief note here that the show has implied a number of figures from earlier hero generations whose placements are mostly historical. The Immortal carries memory of teams and heroes from earlier eras, and the show's occasional flashbacks make clear that the upper middle bracket of this universe has been continuously occupied for a very long time by figures whose individual entries on this chart we are not going to attempt because their on-screen presence is limited. The chart can note that the upper middle bracket has a long history, that the figures we have named are inheritors of a tradition the show takes seriously, and that the placements we have given are part of a larger pattern the series keeps gesturing toward. We turn now to a longer reflection on the upper bracket, because the chart's structure cannot fully express what the show is doing with the figures at the top. The top tier of this universe is, in the show's careful framing, a group of beings whose individual encounters can reshape the planet, whose battles produce casualty counts the chart cannot easily contain, and whose moral choices ripple through every other tier on this list. The chart's organization, by raw striking power, can place them, but it cannot quite measure what they are doing to the world they inhabit. The first thing the chart cannot fully express is the way the upper bracket fights leave permanent damage on the planet. The show is careful, in nearly every season it has so far given, to depict the consequences of an upper bracket fight at scale. The cities that have been damaged, the civilian populations that have been displaced, the long-term reconstruction that the agency has to coordinate in the wake of every confrontation between figures in the top tier. No ranking can measure the cost of a fight. The chart can only note that the figures at the top of the list are, by virtue of their placement, the source of the most expensive events the world has to absorb, and that the show keeps quietly making the case that the chart's upper bracket is a problem the world does not know how to solve. The second thing the chart cannot fully express is the way the upper bracket fights produce arguments inside the heroes about what the work is for. The show keeps using the top-tier confrontations as moments where the heroes are forced to ask themselves what kind of figures they want to become, what costs they are willing to bear, what kinds of damage they are willing to inflict in the name of a result they believe is worth it. A power chart cannot rank a moral position. It can only note that the figures at the top of the list are, by virtue of their placement, the figures whose moral choices the show treats as the most consequential, and that the series keeps insisting that the question of who they are is the question that actually matters. not the question of how hard they can hit. Third thing the chart cannot fully express is the way the upper bracket fights involve audiences inside the show itself. The civilians in this universe see the fights, watch them on news broadcasts, debate them in their lives, and the show keeps quietly making the case that the chart's top tier is not just a list of beings, but a list of public figures whose actions are interpreted by an audience that has to decide what to make of them. Reputation cannot be ranked. The chart can only note that the figures at the top of the list are, by virtue of their placement, public figures whose identities are shaped by the way the world watches them, and that the show is, in part, a series about what it does to a person to be watched at that scale. We turn now to a small number of additional figures the chart deserves to address, including some whose on-screen presence has been limited, but whose implied placements add to the texture of this universe. Pilot, a figure from the wider coalition of planets, is one of the small group of beings whose appearance in the show has established that the universe contains tactical figures whose individual capability is in the upper middle bracket, but whose role in the wider story is meaningful. The chart can place Pilot in the upper middle bracket, with the note that his role in the coalition's wider operations gives him a tactical placement higher than his individual entry would suggest. The show has used him in moments where the audience needs to feel that the universe outside Earth contains figures who are part of a larger resistance, and the chart should at least note that the upper middle bracket of this list extends into the galactic story as well. The astounding Wolfman and Brit, whose names are part of the wider connected continuity of the source material, deserve a small note here. The show has not, at the time of speaking, given these figures the kind of presence that would let us rank them with the same confidence as the figures we have named, and we are going to be careful not to state comic-specific feats as if they have aired in the show. What we can note is that the source material implies a wider connected hero community, whose individual entries on the chart would extend the upper middle bracket meaningfully, and that the show may yet bring these figures into its frame as later seasons air. The chart's structure can accommodate them if and when they arrive. Tech Jacket is another figure from the wider source material, whose presence in the show has been limited, but whose implied placement is in the upper middle bracket. The chart can note his existence and his rough tier without committing to specific feats that have not been confirmed in the series. The argument the chart is making here, read this way, is that the upper middle bracket of this universe is, in the show's wider implications, substantially deeper than the individual entries we have named, and that this list is, in a sense, a partial reading of a fuller list the show has gestured toward. The Order, a villain team from the source material, deserves a brief note as well. The show has used team-based villain dynamics in its earlier seasons, and the Order, in the wider continuity, represents a particular kind of organized mid-tier threat, whose individual members are in the lower middle bracket of this chart, and whose collective capability puts them in the upper middle. We are going to leave them with that note, with the understanding that the chart's middle brackets are deeper than the individual entries we have given. A brief note here that the show's wider villain Ecology contains a number of figures whose individual placements we have not specifically addressed. The Reaniman Project, the Mahler Twins commercial work, Machine Head's network, and the various smaller crews that operate in the show's background all represent figures in the lower middle bracket whose individual entries would extend the chart, but whose collective placement we have already discussed. The chart's structure is, in this sense, a partial reading, and the show keeps quietly arguing that the actual depth of this universe's villain population is larger than any single ranking can capture. We are going to spend a longer stretch now on the question the chart cannot quite answer, the question of where the upper tier of this universe actually ends. The show has, at the time of speaking, given the audience a number of figures in the top bracket whose individual placements against one another are genuinely contested, and the chart's structure can only sketch the relationships between them in outline. The Viltrumite Empire, taken collectively, is the dominant force on the chart's top tier, with a population of warriors whose baseline puts them in the upper bracket of this universe. Battle Beast, in his on-screen appearances, is one of the very few non-Viltrumite figures whose individual capability is comparable to the Empire's elite. Alan the Alien, by the middle of the show's run, has demonstrated that he can engage Viltrumites on something close to equal terms, which places him in the upper bracket of this list. Theorized, in his implied role in the wider galactic story, is one of the rare Viltrumites whose individual standing is significant enough to mean a real counterweight to the Empire's leadership. Thragg, in the source material, and in the show's implied trajectory, is the supreme commander of the Empire and the figure at the top of the chart. Where the chart's structure breaks down, in the careful reading the show invites, is in the question of who would actually win a fight between the figures at the top. The show has, at the time of speaking, given a small number of individual confrontations that the audience can use to calibrate the chart, but it cannot fully predict the outcomes of fights the show has not yet staged. The honest position for the ranking is to acknowledge that the top of the chart is, in a sense, a cluster of figures whose individual placements against one another are open to interpretation, and that the show keeps quietly arguing that the question of who would win is less important than the question of what those fights would cost. A brief note here that the chart structure is also limited by the question of which version of each figure we are placing. Mark Grayson, at the start of the series, is in the upper middle bracket. Mark Grayson, by the middle of the show's run, is in the upper bracket on the cusp of the very top. Mark Grayson, by the implied end of his arc, is on the path to the very top of the chart. The chart, strictly speaking, places him at his confirmed current capability, but it cannot quite express the trajectory the show keeps implying. The same is true of Adam Eve, whose chart placement at her constrained capability is meaningfully lower than her implied ceiling. The same is true of Oliver, whose chart placement as a child is meaningfully lower than his adult ceiling is implied to be. We are going to add now a small number of additional figures whose appearances in the show have been brief, but whose placements deserve at least a note for the sake of completeness. The Lizard League members, taken individually, are in the lower middle bracket of this chart. King Lizard, whom we have already named, is the leader of the team and slightly above his teammates by individual capability. Komodo Dragon, whom we have also named, is in the same bracket. Iguanus, Salamander, and the other members of the League are in the lower middle bracket as well, comfortably above an ordinary human, comfortably below any of the upper tier figures we have named. The chart can place them collectively in the lower middle bracket with the note that their main function in the show is to give the heroes mid-tier opposition between the major arcs. The various criminal crews the show keeps using as background, including the Magmanites, the Kursks, and the various smaller villain teams that pass through the show's larger story, are in the lower middle of the chart as individuals. The chart's collective placement of these figures is in the same bracket as the Lizard League and the Order, and we are going to leave them with that note. The Lifeline wing of the Global Defense Agency, a unit whose presence the show has implied through the agency's wider operations, deserves a small note here. The chart cannot rank an institutional unit, but it can note that Cecil's agency is, in the show's careful framing, more than a single director and his immediate staff, and that the agency's wider operations include figures whose individual placements on the chart we have not addressed, but whose collective presence is a meaningful part of the upper middle bracket structure. We return now to the upper bracket figures, because the chart's structure deserves one more careful look at the top before we close. Nolan Grayson, in the deeper reading of his arc, is one of the figures the show uses to ask its central question about the cost of the chart's upper bracket. He is, by raw striking power, in the very top of the chart. He is, by the show's careful framing, one of the most morally weighted figures the series has produced. The argument the show keeps making about him, across the seasons we have so far seen, is that the figures at the top of the chart are paying a cost for their placement, that the work of being at the top is not a triumph, but a burden, and that the question of what kind of figure Nolan is becoming is the question that actually matters in his arc. The chart can place him in the very top bracket. It cannot fully express the weight the show keeps putting on his arc. Mark Grayson, in the deeper reading of his trajectory, is the figure whose chart placement the show keeps using to argue its central thesis. He is, in the early seasons, in the upper middle of the chart. He is, in the middle seasons, in the upper bracket on the cusp of the very top. He is, by the implied end of his arc, on the path to the very top of the chart. The show keeps making the case that Mark's trajectory is not just a matter of accumulating raw striking power, but of accumulating the moral weight that comes with that capability, and that the question of who Mark becomes as he climbs the chart is the question the series is most interested in. The chart can place him in the upper bracket. It cannot fully express what the show is doing with his arc. Alan the Alien, in the deeper reading of his role in the wider story, is the figure whose chart placement the show keeps using to argue its galactic thesis. He is, in the early seasons, in the upper middle of the chart. He is, by the middle of the show's run, in the very top bracket. He is, in the implied end of his arc, a figure whose individual placement on the chart is comparable to the very strongest of the Viltrumite Elite. The show keeps making the case that Alan's role in the wider universe is to provide a counterweight to the Empire's dominance, and that the question of his individual capability is bound up with the larger question of whether the Empire can be meaningfully resisted. The chart can place him in the top bracket. It cannot fully express what the show is doing with his role. Thragg, in the deeper reading of his presence in the wider story, is the figure the chart keeps placing at the top. As the source material casts him, he is the strongest individual Viltrumite who has ever lived. In the show's careful framing, he is the supreme commander whose decisions shape the Empire's wider strategy. In the chart's structure, he is the figure at the absolute top of the upper bracket. We are going to be careful here about not stating comic-specific events as if they have aired in the show. What we can say is that the chart's top placement, on what has been confirmed and on what the source material supports, is Thragg, with a small note that the figures immediately beneath him on the chart are close enough that the difference between them and his placement depends on details the show has not yet fully delivered. We have now placed every figure we can confidently address from the show's confirmed continuity and from the source material's careful implications. The chart's structure, taken as a whole, is a partial reading of a fuller universe the show keeps gesturing toward, and any honest ranking has to acknowledge that the chart cannot quite capture what the series is doing. The figures at the top of the chart are not, in the show's careful framing, simply the strongest beings in the universe. They are figures whose placements carry costs the chart cannot measure, whose arcs the series treats with care, and whose moral weight is part of why the chart exists at all. We are going to spend some additional time now with the figures whose chart placements the show has implied may shift as later seasons air. The arc of Invincible, in its confirmed continuity so far, keeps quietly arguing that the chart's structure is not static, that the figures we have placed are in motion, and that the question of where they will end up is part of what the series is interested in. Mark Grayson's trajectory is the most explicit of these. The show keeps demonstrating that Mark's raw striking power is growing, that his combat experience is accumulating, that his ceiling is implied to be substantially higher than what we have so far seen. The chart's placement of him is, strictly speaking, a placement at the time of speaking, and the chart's structure should accommodate the possibility that Mark may move up the chart significantly as later seasons air. Adam Eve's trajectory is the second most explicit. The show keeps demonstrating that Eve's ability is constrained, that her ceiling is implied to be substantially higher than what we have so far seen, and that the question of whether and when she lets go of the constraint is one of the open questions of the series. The chart's placement of her is, strictly speaking, a placement at her constrained capability, and its structure should accommodate the possibility that Eve may move up significantly if and when the show develops her unconstrained ceiling. Oliver's trajectory is the third most explicit. The show keeps demonstrating that Oliver's biology is hybrid in a way that produces accelerated growth, and that his ceiling, as an adult, is implied to be in the upper bracket of the chart. The chart's placement of him is, strictly speaking, a placement at his current childhood capability, and the structure should accommodate the possibility that Oliver may move up significantly as he grows. A brief note here that the show has implied a number of trajectories for other figures that the chart's structure could accommodate. Alan the Alien's trajectory is implied to be on the cusp of the very top of the chart. Mark's trajectory is implied to be on the path to the same. The reformed Guardians of the Globe, taken collectively, are implied to be on a trajectory of becoming a more capable team as their members gain experience. The Viltrumite Empire's wider population, taken collectively, is implied to be a relatively static force at the upper bracket's baseline, although individual figures within the Empire may move up or down the chart depending on the show's wider arcs. We have spent a great deal of time now on the upper bracket and on the figures whose trajectories the show keeps implying. We are going to turn now, briefly, to the question of what the chart's structure means for the universe as a whole, before we close out the ranking. The chart's structure, in the deepest reading the show invites, is a kind of organizing frame for a question the series keeps asking, without ever fully answering. The question of what power actually is, in a universe where the difference between the bottom of the list and the top is the difference between a man who can hold a sewing needle and a being who can crack a planet. The show keeps quietly insisting that the chart structure is, in a sense, the source of every problem in the series. The difference in capability between the top and the bottom is so vast that the universe cannot easily be organized around any single set of moral assumptions. The figures at the bottom of the chart are, in the show's careful framing, the people who pay the cost of every action the figures at the top take. The figures at the top of the chart are, in the show's careful framing, the people whose moral choices the audience is meant to weigh most carefully, because the consequences of those choices are at a scale the lower bracket cannot recover from. The chart's structure is, in this sense, both a description of the universe and a critique of it. We are going to return now to one of the questions the chart keeps raising, the question of what the upper bracket of this universe actually costs the planet that contains it. The show has, across its run, been remarkably consistent in depicting the wider consequences of the upper bracket's existence. The first season finale, in particular, is one of the most extended demonstrations the show gives of what a top-tier confrontation actually does to a major city, and the chart's placement of the figures involved in that confrontation is part of why the consequences are at the scale the show depicts. The second season's later episodes return to the wider consequences of the upper bracket's wars, and the third season continues that argument with even larger stakes. The chart cannot rank the cost of the upper bracket's existence, but it can note that the cost is one of the central themes of the series, and that the upper bracket's placement on the list is, in part, a measurement of how much the planet has had to absorb for them to operate. The chart can also note that the upper bracket's existence is, in the show's careful framing, what allows the universe to be the kind of place where the lower bracket's lives are possible at all. Cecil's agency, with its compromises and its difficult choices, is part of a wider apparatus that exists, in part, because the upper bracket of this universe makes a normal civilian life impossible without coordinated defense. The figures in the upper middle bracket are, in part, the heroes whose presence makes the lower bracket's daily existence less precarious. The figures in the top bracket are, in part, the figures whose presence ensures that the universe is not casually overrun by the Empire's wider operations. The chart's structure, in this deeper reading, is not just a list of who can hit hardest. It is a sketch of the wider ecosystem the show is depicting, an ecosystem in which the lower bracket depends on the upper bracket for its survival, even as it pays the cost of the upper bracket's existence. We turn now to a final round of additional figures whose placements the chart deserves to address, before we close out the ranking and move to the outro. Knockout and Pegasus, and the various adjacent figures from the wider source material are the next entries. The show has not, at the time of speaking, given these figures the kind of presence that would let us rank them with the same confidence as the figures we have named, and we are going to be careful not to state comic-specific feats as if they have aired in the show. What we can note is that the source material implies a wider hero community, whose individual entries on the chart would extend the upper middle bracket meaningfully, and that the chart's structure can accommodate them if and when the show brings them into its frame. The various background figures the show has implied through the agency's wider operations are the next entries to address. The Global Defense Agency has, in the show's careful framing, a roster of figures whose individual placements are mostly in the lower middle and middle of the chart, and whose collective presence is part of what allows the agency to function. A power chart cannot rank an institutional roster in detail, but it can note that the agency's wider population includes figures in the middle brackets of the list whose individual entries we have not specifically addressed. The wider villain population, taken collectively, deserves a return note. The show has, across its run, established that this universe contains a large background population of mid-tier villains, whose individual entries on the chart we have not specifically addressed. The chart's lower middle and middle brackets are, in this sense, substantially deeper than the individual entries we have named, and the chart's structure is, in a sense, a partial reading of a fuller list the show keeps gesturing toward. The wider hero population, taken collectively, deserves the same return note. The show has, across its run, established that this universe contains a background of mid-tier heroes, whose individual entries on the chart we have not specifically addressed. The chart's middle and upper middle brackets are, in this sense, substantially deeper than the individual entries we have named. A brief note here that the chart's structure has, in this ranking, been organized around the individual figures whose on-screen presence the show has confirmed, and whose ranking we can make with confidence. The chart's depth is, in this sense, a function of how thoroughly we are willing to address the figures whose presence the show has implied, but not fully developed. We have been careful, in the placements we have made, to distinguish between what the show has confirmed and what the source material suggests, and we have been careful to leave the chart's open questions as open questions rather than closing them with confidence we do not have. We turn now to a longer reflection on the question the chart cannot quite answer, the question of what the figures we have placed actually mean to the audience and to the show itself. The chart is, in a sense, a partial reading of a universe whose real depth lies in the way the figures interact with one another, in the way their arcs are woven together, in the way the show keeps using the chart's structure to ask questions about who its characters are and who they are becoming. Mark Grayson's arc, in the careful reading the show invites, is the spine of the entire series. The chart's placement of him is, strictly speaking, a placement at his current capability, but it cannot quite express what the show is doing with his trajectory. The series keeps quietly arguing that Mark's chart placement is, in a sense, the question of who he is becoming, that the difference between the version of Mark we met at the start of the series and the version we are watching now is not just a difference in raw striking power, but a difference in moral weight, in experience, in the kind of figure he has chosen to be. The chart can note that Mark is climbing the list. It cannot quite note that the climb is, in the show's careful framing, the central question of the entire series. Nolan Grayson's arc, in the careful reading the show invites, is the other spine of the series. The chart's placement of him is in the very top bracket, and it can note that his arc is one of the most morally weighted figures the show has produced. The series keeps quietly arguing that Nolan's chart placement is, in a sense, the question of what kind of figure he is choosing to be, that the difference between the version of Nolan we met in the first season and the version we are watching now is, in the show's careful framing, not just a difference in his moral position, but a difference in what the chart's top bracket actually means. Nolan is, in the show's wider implications, a figure whose chart placement carries with it the question of whether the upper bracket of this universe can be occupied by a being who has chosen to be other than what his species' tradition demands. The chart can note that Nolan is in the top bracket. It cannot quite note what the show is doing with his arc. Adam Eve's arc, in the careful reading the show invites, is one of the most thematically central in the series. The chart's placement of her is on the cusp of the very top, with the note that her implied ceiling is meaningfully higher. The series keeps quietly arguing that Eve's chart placement is, in a sense, the question of what kind of figure she chooses to be, that the constraints on her ability are, in the show's careful framing, both psychological and inherited, and that the question of whether she lets go of those constraints is one of the open questions of the series. The chart can note that Eve is on the cusp of the top. It cannot quite note what the show is doing with her arc. A brief note here that the chart's placement of the supporting figures around these three is, in the show's careful framing, part of what gives the central arcs their weight. Debbie Grayson's placement at the bottom of the chart is, in a sense, the chart's recognition that the central arcs are paid for in the cost she has had to absorb. William Clockwell's placement is the chart's recognition of the loyalty that has held Mark's life together through the worst moments of his arc. Amber Bennett's placement is the chart's recognition of the cost of being in the orbit of the chart's upper brackets without sharing their capability. Cecil Stedman's placement is the chart's recognition of the apparatus that allows the chart structure to function at all. These placements are, strictly speaking, in the lower brackets of the chart. They are, in the show's careful framing, part of what makes the chart's upper brackets meaningful. We turn now to a final set of additional figures the chart deserves to address, before we close out the ranking. The mother of Adam Eve, who appears in some of the show's quieter scenes, is in the lower bracket of the chart, an ordinary woman whose presence in the story is one of the moments the show uses to argue that the chart's upper brackets are not produced in isolation but in families. She has no powers of her own. She has the chart's lower bracket placement of an ordinary human, and she has, in the show's careful framing, the weight of being the parent of one of the figures whose chart placement is on the cusp of the very top. The various roommates and friends and college acquaintances who appear in Mark's wider social life are in the lower bracket of the chart, ordinary humans whose placements are part of the chart's lower foundation. The chart cannot rank a friendship. It can only note that the lower bracket of the chart is, in part, made up of the figures whose proximity to Mark gives his arc its emotional weight. The various teachers and supporting figures from the show's college and high school scenes are in the lower bracket of the chart as well, ordinary humans whose placements are part of the chart's lower foundation. The chart's depth at the lower bracket is, in this sense, substantially greater than the individual entries we have specifically addressed, and the chart's structure should be understood as a partial reading of a fuller universe. We turn now to a final reflection on the chart as a whole. The ranking we have built tonight is, in the careful reading, a partial sketch of a universe whose depth the show keeps gesturing toward. The chart's structure has, in this ranking, been organized around raw striking power, with notes about the tactical, moral, and emotional placements the chart cannot fully express. The chart's top bracket contains a small number of figures whose individual placements against one another are open questions, and the chart's lower and middle brackets contain a much larger population whose individual entries we have addressed where we could and gestured toward where we could not. The chart structure has, in this ranking, also been organized around what the show has actually confirmed and what the source material supports. We have been careful, throughout, to distinguish between what the show has shown on screen and what the comics suggest, and we have been careful to leave open questions as open questions rather than closing them with confidence we do not have. The chart's top placements are, in this sense, placements at the time of speaking, and the chart structure should accommodate the possibility that later seasons may shift the rankings in ways the audience can already partially predict. A brief note here that the chart structure has, in this ranking, also been organized around the show's wider arguments about what power means in a universe like this one. The chart cannot rank a moral position. It cannot rank the cost of the upper bracket's existence. It cannot rank what the show is doing with its central arcs. It can only sketch the relationships between the figures we have placed, and let the audience weigh those relationships against the wider story the series is telling. We have, in this ranking, placed the entire chart from the bottom to the top. The figures at the bottom of the chart are ordinary humans whose placements are in the lower bracket of the list. The figures in the lower middle of the chart are the wider villain and hero ecology of the universe. The figures whose individual capabilities are mid-tier and whose collective presence gives the chart its depth. The figures in the middle of the chart are the heroes whose placements are between the mid-tier and the upper bracket, the teen team and the wider Guardians membership, and the adjacent figures whose individual entries we have addressed. The figures in the upper middle of the chart are the founding heroes and the reformed Guardians senior membership, and the adjacent figures whose placements are at the cusp of the upper bracket. The figures in the upper bracket of the chart are the figures whose individual capability is in the top tier, the Viltrumite line, the Battle Beast tier, the Adam Eve at her peak tier, the cosmic adjacent figures. The figures in the very top bracket of the chart are the figures whose placements are at or near the absolute top, the Nolan tier, the Mark Trajectory tier, the Alan tier, the Theorized tier, the Thragg tier. A brief note here that the chart structure has, in this ranking, also been organized around the question of who the show treats as the most consequential figures in its wider story. Mark Grayson is, in the show's careful framing, the central figure of the series, and the chart's placement of him is on a trajectory the show keeps quietly arguing will end at or near the top of the chart. Nolan Grayson is, in the show's careful framing, the other central figure of the series, and the chart's placement of him is in the very top bracket. Adam Eve is, in the show's careful framing, the figure whose implied ceiling is the highest of any of the Earth-based heroes, and the chart's placement of her is on the cusp of the very top. These three figures are, in a sense, the chart's central placements, and the rest of the chart is, in some respects, organized around them. We have walked the chart from the bottom to the top tonight, and we have spent time with the figures whose placements deserved more than the strict ranking could give. We have addressed the wider implications of the chart's structure and the questions the chart cannot quite answer. We have left the open questions as open questions, and we have placed the figures we can place with confidence. We will turn now to the outro, and we will close out the night with a reflection on what the chart means and on what the show is doing with its wider story. There is something that the Invincible series keeps quietly insisting on, across every season it has so far given, and it is the question we are going to sit with as we close out the night. The question is not who is the strongest. The question is not whether Nolan would beat Thragg in a fight, or whether Alan has finally caught up to the Viltrumite Elite, or whether Mark's ceiling is really at the top of the chart. The question is, what kind of universe is being depicted when the chart we have spent these hours building is, in the show's careful framing, the source of nearly every problem the series is trying to think through. The chart's structure is a problem the show is trying to address. The chart's upper bracket is a burden the show is asking the audience to weigh. The chart's lower bracket is a foundation the show keeps reminding the audience to remember. The chart is, in this sense, both a description of the universe and a critique of it, and the question of what to do with that critique is the question the series keeps quietly leaving with us. Invincible has, at the time of speaking, given the audience a substantial portion of a story that is still unfolding, and the show's wider arc keeps implying that the chart we have built tonight is not a final placement, but a snapshot of a moving picture. The figures at the top of the chart are still developing. The figures in the middle and lower brackets are still living their lives. The figures in the wider galactic story are still moving through their arcs. The chart structure is, in this sense, alive, and the question of where each figure will end up is part of what the series is asking the audience to keep watching for. The series has, in its careful framing, made the case across its seasons that the chart structure is the wrong question and the right question at the same time. It is the wrong question in the sense that the chart's placements cannot capture what the show is actually doing with its characters, that the chart's mechanical measurements cannot rank a moral weight or a personal cost or a relationship. It is the right question in the sense that the chart's placements are the conditions under which the show's characters have to operate, that the upper bracket exists, that the lower bracket exists, that the difference between them is real and consequential and unavoidable. The show keeps using the chart structure to set up its central questions, and the answers it keeps gesturing toward are questions about what kind of figures the chart's various brackets contain, rather than about how the chart's brackets are arranged. We are going to close out the night now with a final reflection on the series. The Invincible series, in its confirmed continuity so far, is one of the most carefully constructed superhero adaptations the medium has produced, and the chart we have built tonight is part of why that careful construction works. The figures at the top of the chart are not, in the show's framing, set dressing for the lower brackets to react to. They are, in the show's framing, the figures whose moral weight the audience is meant to engage with most carefully, and the chart structure is the way the show makes that weight feel real. The figures at the bottom of the chart are not, in the show's framing, victims for the upper brackets to protect. They are, in the show's framing, the universe in which the upper brackets are operating, and the chart structure is the way the show keeps reminding the audience that the upper brackets are not operating in a vacuum. The series, in the careful reading, is a story about responsibility, about the costs that come with being in the upper brackets of a universe like this one, about the question of what kind of figure a person chooses to be when the chart structure makes ordinary moral assumptions difficult. The chart we have built tonight is, in this sense, a way of thinking about the series rather than a final answer to its central questions, and the chart's placements should be understood as a way of organizing the audience's thinking rather than a final ranking of who matters most. We have walked from the bottom of the chart to the top tonight. We have placed Art Rosenbaum at the foundation, with his careful hands and his thread, and we have placed Thragg at the apex of the chart, with the empire he commands and the wider story the series keeps building toward. Between them, we have placed every figure we could verify from the show's confirmed continuity and from the source material's careful implications. The chart is now complete, in the careful sense, and we are going to sit with it for a moment before we close out the night. Before we move into the closing reflection, we are going to spend a final stretch with a small set of figures whose placements deserve at least a short note for the sake of completeness, because the chart we have built has been organized around the major figures, and the show's careful framing keeps reminding us that the supporting cast is part of what makes the chart's structure meaningful. The figures who populate the news desks and broadcast studios of this universe are, strictly speaking, in the lower bracket, ordinary humans whose roles in the wider story are about how the chart's upper bracket is communicated to the wider public. The show has, across its run, used the various journalists and news anchors of this universe as small chorus figures, marking the way the wider public absorbs the chart's events and reacts to them. A power chart cannot rank a profession, but it can note that these figures sit at the foundation of the wider story, that their presence is part of how the show makes the chart's events feel like they have weight in a real world. The figures who appear briefly in the show's various civilian scenes, the people on the streets in the cities where the upper bracket fights take place, the people in the buildings that come down during the chart's most consequential events, are in the lower bracket of the chart as well. A power chart cannot rank a bystander, but it can note that the universe's lower bracket is, in a sense, the entire civilian population, and that the chart's structure carries with it the implication that every one of those bystanders is in the chart's foundation. The show has, in moments scattered across its run, given the audience small flashes of what the upper bracket's events look like from the ground, and those flashes are part of what the chart should be understood to include, even when individual entries are not named. The various scientists and researchers in the agency's wider operations, including the figures who appear briefly in the show's research scenes, and the figures whose work makes the agency's broader systems possible, are in the lower bracket of the chart. The chart cannot rank an institutional research staff, but it can note that the agency's wider work, the systems Cecil has assembled, depend on a large background of skilled human labor that is, strictly speaking, in the chart's lower bracket. These figures are, in a sense, part of the foundation that allows the chart's upper bracket to function at all. The figures who appear in the show's brief flashbacks to earlier hero generations, including the various members of older incarnations of the Guardians of the Globe and the wider hero community that preceded the events of the series, are at the chart's various brackets depending on what we have been told about them. The chart cannot rank a flashback without seeing the figures in full, but it can note that the universe has a long hero history that the show keeps gesturing toward, and that the chart's middle and upper middle brackets have, in this sense, a history that extends backwards into the universe's wider story. A brief note here that the chart structure has, in this ranking, been deliberately organized to leave room for the figures the show has not yet fully developed. The series is still telling its story, and the chart's placements are, in this sense, placements at the time of speaking. The chart structure should accommodate the possibility that later seasons will introduce figures whose placements we cannot now predict, and the chart's depth is, in this sense, an open question rather than a closed list. We turn now to one final set of placements before the outro, focusing on a few characters whose appearances in the show deserve at least a short reflection. Universa, in the source material's careful framing, is a figure of cosmic significance whose chart placement, if the show eventually develops her full background, would be in the upper bracket. The chart's placement of her, on what the show has actually shown, is in the lower middle bracket. The honest position for the ranking is to note that her two placements are very different, and that the chart's structure has chosen to place her on what has actually aired, rather than on what the source material implies. We are going to leave her in the lower middle bracket with that note, with the understanding that the chart may move her up significantly as later episodes air. The various Rhiannon generations, taken individually, are in the lower middle bracket of the chart. The early Rhiannon are at the lower edge of this bracket, clumsy and easily defeated. The later Rhiannon are at the upper edge of this bracket, tougher and more dangerous. The collective placement of the project, as a wider phenomenon in the show's careful framing, is in the lower middle bracket as well, with the note that the project's existence is one of the show's more sustained arguments about what happens when the chart's lower brackets are treated as resources rather than as people. The various Sequid hosts we have already noted, the upper-tier figures who have been compromised by Sequid attachment, are at the chart's brackets depending on which original figure has been compromised. The chart cannot rank a compromised host without knowing the original figure, but it can note that the show has used this phenomenon to argue that the chart's upper bracket is, in a sense, vulnerable to forms of attack that the strict ranking does not address. The figures who appear in the show's brief galactic background scenes, the wider population of the coalition of planets, and the wider population of the worlds the Viltrumite Empire has conquered, are at the chart's various brackets depending on what we have been shown about them. The chart cannot rank an unnamed background population, but it can note that the universe's wider galactic story implies a depth at the upper middle and middle brackets that the chart's individual entries do not fully capture. We will turn now to a final reflection on the chart and on the series, before we close out the night with the outro proper. The Invincible series is, in the careful reading it invites, a story whose central question is not where each figure sits on a power chart, but what kind of figure each character chooses to be in a universe where the chart's structure makes ordinary moral assumptions difficult. The chart we have built tonight is, in this sense, a tool for thinking about the series rather than a final answer to its central questions, and the chart's placements should be understood as descriptions of capability rather than judgments on character. The series keeps quietly arguing that the chart's upper bracket is, in some respects, a burden rather than a triumph. The figures at the top of the chart are bearing a weight the rest of the universe cannot quite share, and the question of what kind of figures they choose to be is, in the show's careful framing, the question the series is most interested in. The chart can note that Nolan Grayson is in the top bracket. It cannot quite note that the question of who Nolan is choosing to be is the question that defines his arc. The chart can note that Mark Grayson is on a trajectory toward the top of the chart. It cannot quite note that the question of who Mark is choosing to be is the question that defines the series. The chart can note that Adam Eve is on the cusp of the very top. It cannot quite note that the question of who Eve is choosing to be, especially in light of her implied ceiling, is one of the open questions of the series. The chart also keeps quietly arguing that its lower bracket is, in some respects, where the show's moral weight actually lives. Debbie Grayson's placement at the bottom of the chart is, in the show's careful framing, a recognition of the cost she has had to absorb to make the chart's upper bracket arcs possible. William Clockwell and Amber Bennett's placements at the bottom of the chart are recognitions of the cost of being in the orbit of the chart's upper brackets without sharing their capability. The chart cannot rank a cost. It can only note that the lower bracket of this universe is, in the show's careful framing, where the chart's upper bracket's burdens are absorbed, and that the chart's structure carries with it an implicit moral weight the strict ranking does not address. The chart's middle and upper middle brackets are, in the show's careful framing, the figures whose role in the wider story is to keep the upper bracket's wars from overwhelming the lower bracket. The Guardians of the Globe, in their original and reformed incarnations, are at the upper middle bracket of the chart, and their role in the wider story is to provide Earth with a first line of defense against the chart's upper bracket events. The Teen Team and the various adjacent figures are at the middle bracket of the chart, and their role in the wider story is to provide a secondary line of defense and to be the next generation of the upper middle bracket. The chart's middle brackets are, in this sense, where the show locates the figures whose work is essential, but whose individual placements are not the chart's most decisive. We are going to close out the chart now with a brief reflection on the question of what the chart we have built actually means. The Invincible series is, in the careful reading, a story about a universe whose chart structure is the source of nearly every problem the series depicts, and the chart we have built tonight is, in this sense, a tool for thinking about that wider question rather than a final answer to it. The chart's placements are, strictly speaking, placements at the time of speaking, and the chart structure should accommodate the possibility that later seasons will shift the rankings in ways the audience can already partially predict. The chart's central placements are, in this sense, descriptions of where the show has placed its central figures at the time of the ranking, and the chart's wider structure is a sketch of the universe in which those figures operate. Mark Grayson is, in this sense, on a trajectory toward the top of the chart. Nolan Grayson is, in this sense, in the very top bracket. Adam Eve is, in this sense, on the cusp of the top. Alan the Alien is, in this sense, in the top bracket with a trajectory toward the very top. Thragg is, in this sense, at the absolute top of the chart. The figures in the upper middle and middle brackets are, in this sense, the wider hero community that allows the chart's upper bracket to operate. The figures in the lower middle and lower brackets are, in this sense, the wider universe in which the chart's upper bracket operates, and whose presence gives the chart its moral weight. The chart we have built is, in this sense, a partial reading of a fuller universe, and its structure should be understood as a reading rather than a final ranking. Other readings are possible, and other rankings are defensible. The chart we have built is one reading of the series, and it is the reading that has, in our careful judgment, best reflected what the show has actually shown. We have walked the chart from the bottom to the top tonight, and we have spent time with the figures whose placements deserved more than the strict ranking could give. We have addressed the wider implications of the chart's structure and the questions the chart cannot quite answer. We have left the open questions as open questions, and we have placed the figures we can place with confidence. Invincible, in its place in the wider culture of superhero adaptations, has done something that very few shows of its kind have managed, which is to make the chart's structure feel like a problem, rather than a fact. Most superhero stories take the chart's structure for granted, treating the difference between the top and the bottom of the list as a given condition that the heroes can simply operate within. The Invincible series, by contrast, keeps quietly insisting that the chart's structure is the source of nearly every problem the series is trying to think through, and that the question of what to do with the chart is a question the audience has to keep wrestling with as the series continues. The chart we have built tonight is, in this sense, a small attempt to participate in that wider conversation, and the chart's structure should be understood as a reading, rather than a final ranking. The figures we have placed are, strictly speaking, the figures the show has confirmed, and the figures the source material supports. The chart structure has, in this ranking, been organized around what has actually aired and what the source material implies, and the chart's placements have been made with the caveat that later seasons may shift the rankings in ways we cannot now predict. The chart's central placements are, in this sense, descriptions of where the show has placed its central figures at the time of the ranking, and the chart's wider structure is a sketch of the universe in which those figures operate. The chart we have built is a partial reading of a fuller universe, and the chart's structure should be understood as a reading rather than a final ranking. So we close the night here, with the chart placed and the figures named, with the lights low and the room quiet, and the long climb behind us, from a small tailor at his desk under a single lamp, all the way up to the figures who could move a planet if they were of a mind to. If you have stayed with us this far, thank you for the night, rest easy now, and let the names settle as you drift. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.